Hi. Yeah, so this is our first topic, Introduction to Project Management. It's probably also going to be the longest video that I record, probably because I do want to set the context for the course. I want to set the context for your understanding of what is a project and how the project management framework kind of surrounds it and provides you opportunity. Otherwise, for the most part, my videos after this will either be an introduction to the key issues of the topic and or a specific technique or process that you might want to employ as part of the tools in your toolbox. So with that said, why don't we jump right in and we'll move right along and try not to waste too much time. So what is a project? For the most part, a project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. Really anything. Anything you want to achieve which is both temporary and unique. So we will focus in on those two key issues. So, it is a temporary endeavor, which is to say that it has a start date and an end date. It is not ongoing operations. It interplays and interacts with ongoing operations, but it is not the ongoing operations itself. And because of that, many of the benefits associated with what a project is supposed to achieve often are realized after the end date of the project itself. It is also unique. No two projects are ever exactly the same, although there is quite often commonality from one set of projects or one type of project to another. But it in itself is designed to deliver something singular and thus is unique. And because of its uniqueness, it comes with its own set of risks and uncertainties and challenges because it's not been done before, not specifically the way it is envisioned. And it is the framework of project management, the study, the discipline, the science of project management, which has built up to help manage those uncertainties and to enhance the likelihood of success in the project itself. So that's what we're going to be studying, really, is the framework of project management to hopefully make us better able to succeed when it comes time to doing these temporary, unique endeavors. So where did it all get started? Well, we have to go back actually to the 1940s in the United States, supported by the United Kingdom, where they undertook the development of the atomic bomb, which we know is the Manhattan Project. This singularly challenging, temporary, and unique endeavor is largely recognized as the first modern project. It was the impetus for the early development of a lot of the modern project management techniques. Then, through the 1950s, we saw a couple of very significant developments. First off, we saw PERT, or the Project Evaluation and Review Technique, which came out of the U.S. Navy and their Polaris nuclear submarine project. Now, you may or may not know what PERT is, but it is still very much alive today as a technique that we use in project management for estimating whether it's costs or time for work activities. And then it has largely become integrated with the critical path method, which was developed at DuPont almost at the same time. They were developed almost simultaneously in 1957, 1958. It's probably worth noting that the critical path method, as we know it today, coming out of DuPont, was just an evolution of the scheduling techniques that were derived during the Manhattan Project. Then, 20 years later, after the Manhattan Project, is when NASA, challenged by their president to send a person to the moon, a seemingly insurmountable challenge, launched the Apollo program, which gave rise to a rapid evolution and enhancement of most of the what we recognize as project management theory today. It also established a norm for NASA, good for us, as a researcher and distributor of knowledge in a diversity of fields far beyond space exploration, which they continue in that tradition today. So if we look at more modern times, a great example of a challenging and strategically impactful competing projects might be the Airbus 380 development ongoing almost in parallel at the same time as Boeing set off on the development of the 787 Dreamliner. And that is an interesting case study as far as who came out ahead with respect to those and why. So finally, projects span from great to small, from strategic to tactical delivery, product to capability. So while the framework is established to facilitate the international mega project, the tools and techniques are infinitely scalable to match the project and the industry within which you are working. It is not one size fits all. We'll talk more about the scalability of the framework and the tools and techniques associated with the framework a little later on in this presentation. So, as you know, I'm a civil engineer, a structural engineer, and so it wouldn't be, appropriate for me to miss out on an opportunity to just revel in some of the accomplishments of my industry when it comes to projects. And so in about 10 seconds or less, here are some of the wonderful construction mega projects which have been successful in my industry over the last 50 years or so. Some pretty amazing projects, made for some great visuals, but hopefully you saw these are all kind of mega projects, but then mega projects come with different scale too. I mean, we think of the, let's look here. You have the $615 million project for the Tacoma Narrows side-by-side bridges. That pales in comparison to the Hong Kong International Airport, which was a massive undertaking and topped out at $20 billion. But anyway, that was just for a little bit of fun. So let's carry on with our study of projects. So project management as a discipline has found wide acceptance within industry. It's growing and continues to grow and get greater and greater traction. Now, while this process, the project management, was developed largely to support these large mega projects, indeed it even relied upon their necessity to grow their understanding in order to be successful in the project outcomes itself and their budgets to develop that research. We wouldn't be where we are today without those mega projects. That being said, the tools and techniques and the framework that has come out of these mega projects is no longer simply applicable to large super mega projects. Now, with project management tools also came project management organization. And we will cover that a little bit in one of the later topics where we talk about not just the project manager, but the organization that grows around it or is imprinted upon other types of business organizations and some of the challenges associated with that. Now, it probably is obvious that the rapid growth in the acceptance of project management tools in the discipline is largely attributed to the success that these techniques had in moderating the risk of unique endeavors. Unique endeavors are highly challenging things to do. As a civil engineer, I understand that most of the buildings and bridges that we build are usually unique and one-offs and never repeated again in their exact nature. And they come with very specific challenges because of that uniqueness. Well, all projects are unique. It doesn't matter what industry you're working in, what discipline you're working in. And with that uniqueness comes incredible risk and incredible uncertainty. And so these tools brought some rigor to the managing of those uncertainties and enhanced in the likelihood of success of each individual project. And with that success, of course, we see rapid adoption of those techniques. So now, while the original projects were typically physical and external, later growth in project use was for internal projects, which looked at new product development, business expansion, or service improvement. Anything that can be taken on as a project can benefit from the application of the discipline of project management. So historically, projects, as we talked about, tended to be large. We see a handful of examples there. I mean, if you look at the Three Gorges Dam, really a project which is both in operations but continues today in China, just massive undertakings. But projects are getting larger, and over time, due to the technological complexity surrounding them, the paramount reasons for proliferation of project management has to do with the challenges associated with the projects that they're intended to manage. So we see exponential expansion of human knowledge, the growing demand for a broad range of complex, sophisticated, customized goods and services, and an evolution toward worldwide competitive markets in supply chains and everything else. And it is in this complexity that we see projects getting bigger and more complex, and the environment within which they have to be executed to get more complex, and that demands more rigorous tools and techniques if we're going to succeed in those projects. Now, while projects are getting bigger, we're also seeing the application of these tools and techniques to smaller and smaller projects, and so that is also a trend within project management these days. With the proliferation of the tools, right, they're becoming cheaper. More people are becoming aware of them. More people are being educated in them. I mean, I don't know if there's a undergraduate engineering program out there these days which doesn't introduce some of the techniques associated with project management along the way. And so as those tools and techniques get proliferated, they start to get applied to these smaller projects, and the smaller projects are now more likely to succeed in and of themselves. And so another trend, smaller projects getting smaller, bigger projects getting bigger. So project versus production systems, just to situate ourselves a little bit, three major classes of operations and production systems. First one, mass production systems, very specific processes geared towards high volume, efficient, very difficult to alter. If we look at them on a graph of batch size to volume, we see it up here taking up the dominant place up at the top. This is not where projects exist, obviously. Somewhat closer to the origin then, batch-oriented systems, easier to set up, geared towards large batches. Organizational units specialize in this area, and again, it fills a very dominant spot in this role. But as we close to the origin and we get to our unique one of projects, this is where projects exist. And the one thing that I want to add to this slide that may not be obvious is that really operations start where projects leave off. If you're developing a product, retooling a line, these are all the projects. Operating the line is the operations. Many of the benefits of projects are realized long after the project itself is closed, because that falls to operations and routine work. Whereas the development of the situation, which is going to allow us to monetize or operationalize an idea, happens at the project level. So some of the trends in project management, away from the physical, delivery of a building, a bridge, a new computer program, we see achieving strategic goals, situating the business so that it is ready for the next series of challenges. That could be taken on as a project, and we see a lot of strategic goal projects coming out. Achieving routine goals, again, because of the development and proliferation of project techniques, we see them being used in more routine things. Improving effectiveness or efficiency, so you have a process but you want to examine whether you can make that process more effective or efficient. Very common nowadays to launch on a project to improve the efficiency of your process. Virtual and distributed project teams almost seems trite in the time of COVID. Now we're just like everybody else, but certainly bringing together project teams, because they usually are, or often are, a task-oriented team brought together simply for the project. It became very common that contributors to that project team were not co-located with others, and so virtual teams started to become a bigger and bigger trend within project management. Finally, the last two, dynamic, quasi-projects, iterative, and agile. These are methodologies that allow project management to evolve in an unclear scope where features are not known necessarily, or the end state is not clearly known. And so these methodologies have grown up in project management to provide a technique, or it's not really a technique, a framework or a process by which those types of deliverables could benefit from project management, or the rigor of project management tools and techniques. So the iron triangle. So there are always three direct project objectives. Okay, and we see them here. So we have scope, or your deliverables, your time or schedule, and your cost in dollars. And our path to there are always linking these three together. So we need to deliver something, and we have to do it within budget and hopefully on time. And so there we get this intricate link of these three things together. We can't change one without changing the other. So while each is an objective, there are also constraints that tie them together, because these three are interdependent. And they form the essential constraints, or the iron triangle as it's become known. And so we flip it out here. We see scope, time, and cost as the ultimate triangle of constraints and objectives at the same time. It's probably worth noting, quite often you see quality superimposed in the middle of the triangle, because that is driving these three constraints or objectives all at the same time. Now, if we consider these objectives as constraints, we also have to recognize that they are not all of the constraints. They're an incomplete picture of constraints with respect to the project. We probably want to add quality, as I said, often pictured in the middle of the triangle, but also resources and risk to this list if we wanted to be a more fundamental and wholesome or fulsome picture of the constraints of our project. So along with this, of course, we also often have ancillary goals that we're hoping to achieve over the course of the project. That might be improving an organization's project management competence. It can be developing individual competences as we develop our staff during the project, or maybe gaining a foothold in a new market. There can be any number of ancillary goals that will go with these three objectives. So, major characteristics of a project. We've already discussed briefly the fact that a project is unique. No two projects are ever exactly alike. One-time occurrence, so time limited, have finite duration, established start and end dates. But a couple other things, characteristics, which often occur with projects, and that projects are often interact with each other. Rarely do we get organizations that have a single project going on. Quite often they have more than one project happening at the same time. And these projects become interdependent because they're relying on the same tools and resources in order to make them happen. And so worth remembering that projects usually are interdependent with other projects that are going on. Limited resources. It kind of goes without saying that you're not going to be given a blank slate in order to achieve the outcomes of the project. And so budgets, personnel, all of these resources are going to be constrained when it comes to trying to achieve the outcomes of the project. In many cases, the personnel that you're going to rely on don't actually even work for the project. You're going to rely on personnel that are working for other people. And that leads us to the last major characteristic of a project, which is conflict. There is no workplace that is absent of conflict, at least not that I've ever seen. That being said, some workplaces have more conflict than others. It's become a truism that projects, because of the nature of the way the organizations overlay the time-constrained, resource-constrained objectives of the project, that conflict is something that just permeates across the management of that project. And so, yeah, you have to learn to deal with conflict in a productive and healthy way. And if that's not your strength, then you're probably going to try to steer clear of managing projects as a professional project manager anyway. Can't steer clear of managing projects in your own right, because we all take on projects always. So risk and uncertainty, we can't talk about projects if we don't talk about uncertainty. Every endeavor we take on in life has uncertainty with it, and most people start to develop a understanding of uncertainty, but others never really do. So uncertainty for a project starts right up with the possible errors in the assumptions that were taken during the business case that was developed that led to the acceptance of the project, as an endeavor that we were going to do and authorize the project to move forward. If any of those assumptions were wrong or off, then that could lead to challenges with bringing the project to successful completion on time and on budget. So you have to understand uncertainty when it comes to projects. Now, there's all sorts of types of uncertainty. We see uncertainty in scheduling. We see uncertainty in costs. We see uncertainty in technology. And we're going to talk in much greater detail about uncertainty and risk. But wanted to introduce it as a key component of the project management process. Obviously, this uncertainty represents a risk to project success. And so not only can it be managed, it absolutely must be managed, or there's almost no likelihood that the project is going to complete on time and on budget. So, we all know Murphy's Law. It's nothing new to us. We've probably grown up hearing about it. But if the one thing I would say is that Murphy's Law pretty much guarantees that a project manager lives, sleeps, and breathes risk and risk management during the execution of a project. So then why project management? What's the purpose? The main purpose for initiating a project is to accomplish some goal. So that's not project management. That's why launch a project. Project management, however, increases the likelihood that you're going to accomplish that goal within the constraints laid out, on time, on budget. It also gives us the mechanism by which we assign somebody responsible to spearhead the project and then hold accountable for its completion. You rarely get effective leadership in the absence of accountability. Sorry, not intended to be a dig at government service. So there are downsides to project management. It certainly leads to greater organizational complexity. There are all sorts of different ways to organize a particular business or organization. And quite often the project organization has to be superimposed or laid over top of what the organizational construct is. And this, it just breeds conflict and challenges because of that complexity. There's a higher probability that the organizational policy as it was envisioned then will be violated or confused, and who works for who, and who sets the priorities, and all of those challenges. And some would say even psychologically that by superimposing a project framework over top of, say, a functional organizational layout, that you're implying that the functional managers themselves can't accomplish the desired outcome without this. And so that may cause some concern or self-esteem issues and whatnot. And so all of this brings about conflict. However, this conflict is essential, needs to be managed effectively if we're going to see the project through to successful completion. So a quick introduction of the project manager. So the project manager, obviously the key individual on a project, usually supported by a team depending on the size of the project, or that team may be part-time or full-time working for the project manager. And the project manager then orchestrates the team effort. And I highlight again that many of the team that he's orchestrating probably aren't working directly for him or her. So the project manager orchestrates the team effort, many of whom do not work directly for them. So we have to recognize the challenges that in itself brings, as we discussed in the organizational slide before. So they have to make critical and timely decisions to keep the project moving forward. It usually is a highly dynamic space, most projects, and so there is a day-to-day agility required out of the project manager. In some ways, you can think of the project manager like a little mini CEO. But like the CEO, who has to keep the board informed of what's going on within their organization and everything else, so too must the project manager keep the executive leadership of the organization well up to date, as well as the other stakeholders of the project. And we'll talk a lot about stakeholders as we move forward. So the project manager must be able to harness the corporate power brokers on behalf of the project's benefit, which is to say that they will often find themselves in a situation where they don't have the complete explicit authority to achieve their goals or the goals of the project. And so they have to be very good at bringing influence to bear where their authority is lacking itself. So around any complex endeavor, up pop professional bodies or organizations to help manage it, certify it, you name it. And so the most common project management organization within the North American context now is the Project Management Institute, and I give the URL to their website there. A great resource, certainly an organization that provides certification of project management professionals and other certifications if you're interested in looking at that. It has grown dramatically over the course of my professional life, founded in the late 1960s, 1969, and has grown from about 7,500 members as late as 1990 to almost 500,000 in 190 different countries by just a few years ago. So the PMI organization puts out what we call the Project Management Body of Knowledge, or the PMBOK as it's often referred to. We see a picture of the 6th edition here on this slide. Now, the PMBOK is literally a tomb that describes a complex framework for the practice of project management. Currently in its 6th edition, we do know that the 7th edition, which I understand is going to be a fairly significant rewrite to some components of it, or the way in which it's packaged, is actually rumored to be released in the upcoming months. So the PMBOK or PMI breaks down the practice of project management into a matrix or table. And that table encompasses 5 process groups and 10 knowledge areas. So the process groups themselves, they when you first look at them, they kind of look like the phases of the project. They're not quite the phases of the project in their nuance, but if it helps you to think of them that way, I don't think that's hurtful. The 10 knowledge areas then span these 5 process groups and represent competencies or competency areas that most project managers and their teams need to be effective in. So the study of project management and the study of the PMBOK aren't quite the same thing. I don't think you can study project management without taking advantage of the body of work represented in the PMBOK and integrating to it. It is the dominant framework for project management and encompasses probably most, if not all, of the best practices that are out there. However, there is the dominant study of project management in the professional world probably focuses around the study of the PMBOK itself. And so what you have is people that are working within the project framework, project teams that need to develop their skills and or seek professional certification. And so they set off on a path to study the PMBOK itself. And you'll see most of the professional development courses out there are designed very specifically to get somebody to memorize the processes within the PMBOK so that they can achieve their certification as a project management professional. To study project management, we kind of need we need to take advantage of that body of knowledge, but we need to put it into the context of projects as a tool for business organization, and look more sort of holistically at what project management is. And that's that managerial flavor that we talked about, that strategical impact, and separate ourselves a little bit from some of the jargon that is required in order to be successful on the PMP. Hi, so I wanted to make a few comments about the current edition, or the 7th edition of the Project Management Body of Knowledge. It's been out for about a year and a half, I think. And it represented a fairly major shift in how PMI approaches the PMBOK. Now, the purpose behind the shift was to make their document, their methodology, if you will, more equitable between the various methodologies that you might fall in. So, predictive, agile, hybrid, some sort of iterative format, or the traditional waterfall. And so what they did is they actually removed a lot of the process content, or pretty much all of the process content that went into the previous bodies of knowledge, and they replaced it with a series of principles and knowledge areas. And shortened it down, made it really tiny, and really the changes that they made probably deserve a name change, because it rolled out probably what is a good managerial framework for project management holistically, but it is no longer a body of knowledge of how to do project management. It's not focused on deliverables anymore, but how to provide quality outcomes. So it's good work. I'm really happy with it. But I'm not sure, as a first blush on project management, that it provides adequate depth to understand the nuances of managing projects themselves. So for the most part, you'll see most of the references I maintain look back at the 6th edition of the PMBOK. I think that's completely relevant for the course. I'll continue to evaluate that and figure out if we need to rework it in the future. But for the most part, I think it actually is the best way to go for a first blush. Now, obviously, if you're headed off to look for a PMP certification, then you're going to have to get deep into the 7th edition and the companion products that have, represent the knowledge that has been removed from the PMBOK itself. But that's not what this course is about. So I did want to come on and give just kind of I wanted to give a context to 6th edition, 7th edition. You'll find that there's lots of people out there still referring to the 6th edition because of the changes that have gone on. So anyway, hopefully this information is useful to you. Happy to discuss it on any of the synchronous sessions. And I'll let you get back to the presentation as it was running. So I'll read the quote. Despite that a project is defined as a unique one-time effort, process-oriented management promotes learning and teamwork through the use of a common set of tools and techniques. So what this quote is essentially saying is that even though all projects are unique, there is a common set of objectives that can be achieved through the application of standard processes. So this group of standard processes and techniques that bind together these unique undertakings then is the art, science, or discipline of project management. So let's jump in a little bit into the life cycle of a project to understand it. So this particular slide shows a common project life cycle referred to as the stretched S pattern. And so we're showing percent project complete up the left side with project time or elapsed time along the bottom. And fairly common in a lot of projects, much like I say a construction project. Think of a home construction if you've ever built your own home. Takes a small amount of continual effort or outlay to get the project started as we engage the designers and whatnot. Only a small handful of people can be working at any one time in the early stages. And so we see a slow growth and slow consumption of project resources. And then as construction nears and gets started, we see many, many more people and resources being engaged in the project. And so we see this rapid growth and quick momentum through the middle stage of the project. And then as it nears completion, once again, we see fewer and fewer resources being applied to the project at any one time. And so we see a slow approach to the finish. And so, like I say, classic stretched S for something like a construction project or whatnot. And these examples, the stretched S pattern, is used in a lot of the examples that you're going to see in this course. But it's not the only one that you might see, or might not be the one applicable to your particular project. So the other one that we see fairly often would be the stretched J pattern. Again, we're showing percent project completion up the left-hand side, time along the bottom. But in this case, what we see is a very slow start, like we did in the previous one. However, we just see continual building momentum as we approach the finish right up until the very end. It just grows and grows and grows until the project itself comes to a close. An example of something that might follow this pattern could be an event like a conference or something like that, where you start years in advance of the conference. You have a small organizing committee that works periodically to keep it moving forward as it gains interest and attraction, followed by submission of papers and reviews and everything else. And so the project starts to gain a momentum and consumes a lot more resources, leading up to the grand finale of the conference itself with a fairly rapid close as soon as the conference is done. Even a military exercise would probably follow this kind of a pattern. So now, how is this slide different than the previous ones? Rather than showing a cumulative resources having been expended towards the project, this shows an instantaneous consumption of resources. And so after you have that rapid growth, this is basically the stretched S pattern, just showing instantaneous resources rather than cumulative resources. But what this slide does is it breaks it up into our phases, our most common phases. Now, nothing is ever perfectly standard across any projects because they are unique endeavors. However, these 4 phases tend to apply to most projects. And so we see phase 1, which is the initiation or beginnings, early beginnings. You're into the planning phase or organizing and preparing phase, followed by execution. And after execution, of course, we have to close out the project. And so those are probably the 4 common phases that you'll see referred to in almost all projects. So I did want to talk a little bit about uncertainty again, because uncertainty has to dominate our project. We mentioned it earlier before, how it starts with the earliest assumptions for the project itself. And so what I want to do is to overlay uncertainty on our life cycle, if you will. So this life cycle, the stretched S pattern, only in this case, it is our life cycle portrayed by our project cost. And so this can even start off as our cost baseline forecast out over the duration of the project. But there is uncertainty associated with that cost forecast. We actually don't know every cost with absolute certainty along the way. And so our uncertainty will grow as we look farther and farther into the future, farther along our project. And so it is possible to overlay uncertainty on that project cost. And it would look something like this. And we're going to be talking about uncertainty and risk in some detail as we get to that process, because it does dominate a lot of what we do in projects. So with our uncertainty, as we get farther along our project, as we near our budget on completion, we have fairly large error bars, if you want to think of it that way. Now, of course, we don't work with our initial forecast throughout the entire project. It is common or essential to update our plans as we go along. And at this particular milestone, we've decided to do a reforecast. And so we have a new point of origin, if you will, ideally somewhere within the error bars that we forecast originally for this particular milestone. And then our uncertainty moving forward, again, starts fairly small, but then grows as we approach our end completion at the end. And so we can redo our forecasts and get a better feel of our uncertainty moving forward as the project unfolds. And certainly the longer duration the project is, the more likely you're going to have to reforecast as you move along. So the evolution of cost and risk then. So one thing we do know is that as a project approaches its completion, it costs more to change things. So as more and more things are done or are locked in, they're completed, and if a change comes in near the end, it's more likely to cost us a lot to implement that change than it would if we had known about that change early on. And so that evolution of cost is of value when it comes to managing your change requests, to make sure you understand how that implicates in cost depending on when that change is accepted. Now, conversely, we also know that the risk and uncertainty will go down as the project approaches completion. Why? Well, many of the uncertainties that made up the project are now behind us and no longer are affecting the uncertainty of the project outcomes. And so we see a reduction in the overall project risk as the project nears completion. So these are the 5 process groups that the Project Management Institute, or the PMBOK, break things down into. We see them as a circle here, and I'll try to use these colors to map them so we can keep ourselves focused on where we are within this. But we also often see these laid out linearly, starting with initiation. The definition of the project itself, the authority for the project to move forward, includes the goal settings, definition of the project, authorizes the project manager, establishes the team or the organization that's going to be doing it, gives them a budget, and planning. So probably one of the biggest stages for the project manager, certainly one of the biggest stages or phases or process groups within the framework of project management, is in the planning, as we relate people, money, resources, costs to specific activities and activities to each other. So this is where we're going to figure out how we're going to get to the end. Then, of course, we go through executing, completion of work required to meet the objectives. And then monitoring and controlling, although it's identified as a process group, is not really a phase because it fits across all of these as we track, review, and regulate the progress and performance, give out reports to our stakeholders, whatnot. And finally, the closeout of the project. Now, these process groups, we will be following them as we go through this course to go from one to the next, to give some structure to how we study project management. Now, as mentioned before, PMI also has their competency areas, or their knowledge areas as they call them, and these reflect the complex knowledge that a project manager and their team need to be able to employ effectively if they're going to make sure that the project unrolls successfully. And so the way the PMBOK would do this is, if we take project and we add it to the front of each of these adjectives, and we add management, we add it to the back, and then you would get the 10 names of the knowledge areas, starting with integration and working your way around and finishing with stakeholders. And this is probably why you have to think of the project manager as that jack of all trades, because you need to, the project manager and the team supporting the project manager need to be effective in pretty much all of the knowledge areas associated with modern business. Yeah, so there we have all to come together as the knowledge areas. So I took this old flowchart because, again, we're not studying the PMBOK. We're not studying towards professional certification, but we need to understand the flow of the project in common terms, if you will. And so I took this old flowchart that I had seen used a number of times to lay out a project, and I figured it would be worth using it to grow our understanding of these process groups, because it lacks some of the jargon-filled table that the PMBOK table of processes can imply, and it's not really as intimidating. And so if we start with initiating, what is it? Well, we identify the opportunity and obtain approval to move forward. Well, it's a little bit more than that, and we'll talk about that, but for the most part, that's it. And then we have a fairly large planning section. And so to plan it, we're going to have to define the goals of the project and the relative importance, get that project charter, which initiates the project through the project plan. And then we also have to have our performance measures, so we know what we're going to be measured against for the project success. And effectively, you got to figure out a schedule, got to figure out a budget. And if we don't have all the technological processes already developed to produce our outcomes, we're going to have a plan to do that as well. Certainly, we're going to have to make choices as to whatever technologies we're going to use. And all of that represents the project plan. Add risk to that and a bunch of other sub-plans. And finally, we're going to have to roll out the project itself or implement the plan. And you can't implement the plan if you're not monitoring and controlling it. And so monitoring the project overall, sort of you've got your triggers out there, you're gathering the information, you're seeing what is happening. And when those triggers indicate that you need to take action or review something, then you do that, modify the plan, and let it roll out. So it's this nicely interactive process, and we can see that here. And then finally, you would close out the project and evaluate project success, take your project documents, add to the lessons learned library, and whatnot. So this shows a basic project laid out, but on it, we've overlaid these 5 process groups. And I think that helps us as we go on to look at the more complex table of processes to not get lost in its complexity. So some of the interactive natures of it. So we talked about that table of processes, and this is what that looks like. So this is the project management process group and knowledge area mapping that exists within the PMBOK. And what we get is the 5 process groups are the 5 columns of the table, and then the 10 knowledge areas are the 10 rows. Now, within each of the blocks, the PMBOK lists individual processes that can or should be used to execute any specific task. Individually, there are excellent studies in tasks, techniques that may be useful to you as a project manager, but when viewed holistically like this as an overall table, it in my opinion, it comes off as a little bit process-oriented, jargon-filled, and block some of that holistic understanding of flow that is essential to understanding the project. But individually, absolutely, if you're going to do research in project management, you're going to build it up in bits and groups, and so this reflects some of that really great research which has built up the science or the discipline of project management. So I'm not dissing what is in this table, I'm just saying when you're first learning project management, perhaps more important to understand that flow of the project itself, and then reinforce it with the specific individual skill studies that these processes represent. So if you were pursuing your professional management or project management professional certification, you would probably spend some time to largely memorize this table. We don't need to do that necessarily because we're looking for a more holistic understanding of project management. But quite frankly, at the end of this course, if you can't look at this table and make sense out of it, then we haven't quite got to where we want to go. All of this does make perfect sense. And by the end of the study, you should be able to come back at here and say, oh, I get it now. I see how it flows. And that would be my goal for you, is to be able to do that. So I said I would come back to the scalability of the project framework. This matrix reflects the main processes of the project management framework, and it may or may not be appropriate for you to adopt all of it to effectively manage your project. It's fully expected that you would poach or select the components that are appropriate to you and your project. Some of the things that may determine how much of the framework you should adopt might be the scale of the project, or the specific industry or organization within which your project is set. Smaller projects often benefit from the use of some of these processes, while avoiding being bureaucratically burdened by the holistic application of a framework designed for a highly complex, sometimes international project. So the framework itself, although not necessarily obvious when you first look at it, it also accommodates some of the newer thoughts, iterative methodologies, agile methodologies, which can be creatively integrated into this overall framework. It doesn't, because it's scalable, because it's adaptable, it can be modified and made to work for whatever is appropriate for your industry, your organization, and your project. So I found this image somewhere in my travels, and I thought it worked well in showing the boundaries of a project as it encompasses the 5 process groups. So we start off in this project initiation. So you have your sponsor, a bright idea, you're going through your business case, and you ultimately decide to launch a project. And that starts with the writing and signing of the project charter. And so these are the 5 process groups shown out pictorially for the project itself. We have our initiating processes, so getting that project charter written up, coming from the business documents itself. Now we have the authority to start the project, and we launch into the planning processes, which will roll in a cycle with the executing processes, because as we execute it, we're monitoring and controlling all of this all at the same time. And every time we see that something needs to be modified, we go back to our planning processes, we update the plan, and then put in a change order, roll it forward, and continue on executing it, monitoring and controlling it all the time until we have completion of the project. And so we initiate our closing processes. Now, as we close the project, of course, we have delivered our deliverables to our end user. That was why we set up the project in the first place. But we have also taken our project records and our lessons learned and all of those things, and we have added to the body of knowledge of our organization as well. We're now, hopefully, better able to execute the next project because of the lessons learned in this project. And so those project records and that contribution to the organizational process assets, to use the jargon from PMI, has occurred. And so where does the project exist? Well, of course, it exists in these boundaries, within these boundaries between the initiation of the project and the business documents that led to its acceptance. And once the deliverables and the project records are moved off in the closing and auditing process, our project is completed. And so we see the project boundaries here. Purposely, while the back boundary is shown as fairly sharp and fairly clean, the initiation boundary is fuzzy. And I mean, it's absolutely ideal. We say it right up front that the project manager and key members of the team should be engaged and identified even before the project charter is started, which really means that the project is starting to form up and establish itself early on. I mean, in the ideal sense, the project manager was probably one of the key staff members contributing to the development of the business case, which led to the project selection in its first place. So a project is an organized endeavor. It's a team effort. It's aimed at this specific non-routine or low-volume task. And, you know, it's fairly rare these days, except in the smallest of projects, that a project is done completely by an individual or led by an individual. So you're typically going to have a team, although many of those team members may not be dedicated to that team full time. They're probably working within the functional organization on a full-time basis, and they only have part of their time to contribute towards the project, which adds to the challenges associated with leading the project. The other thing too about the project team is that it is normally disbanded at the end of the project, unless it's set up and moved from project to project, which in some organizations may be the case. Usually an organization, a traditional organization, would establish a project team, they work on it until the project is complete, and then it is disbanded at the end. And that has all sorts of overtones and implications when it comes to the human resource management challenges associated with leading your project team. So poor project results. Why do not all projects work out, other than the inherent uncertainty associated with projects? So I did want to reflect a little bit on that inherent uncertainty. We choose projects, we know they're risky. Just because some of those risks are realized and the project is unsuccessful doesn't mean we necessarily didn't lead it correctly. We accepted that uncertainty when we chose to start the project. We knew that there is a risk that the project might not be successful when it was accepted. And we sometimes lose track of this when it comes to risks and probabilities, that when a probability comes to pass, it doesn't necessarily mean that we did anything wrong leading up to it. Sometimes we just accept that risk, and when it comes to pass, we have to suffer the burden of that risk being realized. We'll talk about that more, but I find even in the project discussion or project management discussion, we sometimes lose touch with the fact that some risks are just accepted, and when they come to pass, we fail. And it was in accepting that risk, it may have been a good choice, and the probability of that coming to pass might have been small, but when it was realized, the endeavor was destined to failure. Think of this past year with the pandemic and how many businesses, small businesses and whatnot, have had to close their doors as a result of a risk which arguably could have been numerically laid out that, there's a chance there's going to be a global pandemic. It's small. We choose to accept that risk. We're not going to mitigate it. We're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to accept it. And when it comes to pass, nothing you can do about it. Your business, unfortunately, at this stage is destined to failure if it doesn't get some kind of a bailout from the government. And so keep that in mind too, that we don't want to think about walking down the path of what happens in some organizations, large organizations, which is basically locking the barn door after the horse is left. We have to evaluate our uncertainties right up front. And if we accept it and it goes wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean you should go out and lock the door. It's done. It's behind you. And if your risk assessment was correct at the time, it's still correct moving forward. So anyway, why do project results, other than that inherent risk being realized, not work out? So what we see, organizations spend billions of dollars every year in creating competitive strategies, and 90% of them fail due to poor execution. Okay, so there is a lot to be done to reduce those risks, those inherent risks of success, by improving our execution capacity. Other reasons for poor results in projects, we know that strategic projects are inherently more risky, and so inherently more risky, less than 50% of them succeed. Now, some of that is because they lacked an appropriate sponsor, or they lacked detailed implementation process, right? If it was poorly defined, if it didn't have a sponsor who was going to provide the influence or the authority necessary for it to succeed, well, you can see that the risks are going up with that poor definition. They say only 40% of projects had adequately skilled personnel. And so obviously by studying project management now, you're going to be able to recognize the advantage of skilled personnel that understand project management and make sure that we have the right people in place in order to do the project. And finally, only 20% of organizations prioritized hiring the appropriate skilled staff rather than just assigning the project to somebody who might have been available at the time. So how do we make it better? Projects, programs, and project portfolios. And so we will talk during the organization a little bit about the integration of projects into programs of interdependent projects and or portfolios of interdependent and dependent projects, and how you can do some of the management choices at the program or portfolio level. And we know that the best firms that are successful in projects have top management involvement. They have the top cover, if you will, or the influence they need in order to be successful when working in that conflict-ridden environment, which is overlaid on the business organization. They have systems set up that grow their internal competence when it comes to project management, those organizational process assets that we talked about a little bit earlier, and they prioritize it. If you prioritize it, you put in the right assets, the right people, the right amount of money, and the right priority to get it to happen. And so by looking at how businesses have failed in some of their projects, we also know that to succeed, really they need to grow their capacity or their skill at implementing projects. So the challenges in project management, things to keep in mind as we initiate our study moving forward. So we clearly have as our primary challenge our triple constraint, our scope, our schedule, and our costs, and that will dominate our thinking. But we also have to stay in touch with the strategic goals. Why was the project chosen in the first place? A project manager needs to be a big thinker. In the military, you use terms like mission analysis, two-up comprehension of what's going on. That is not lost on a project manager. He has to not just understand the scope, constraints of the project charter, but also the organizational strategic context that gave spawn to the project. Ideally, the project manager was integral in those early preparations and then is available to understand the complex business environment implications, those other stakeholders, the outside external stakeholders, being able to engage them, bring influence to bear to optimize the opportunities for success, all of those things. Streamline decision making. Projects are an agile place, not to talk about agile project management, but it requires an agility of response and thus the delegation of authority and responsibility to the level that can manage the trade-offs in the iron triangle effectively on a day-to-day basis, all of those things. So there are many challenges, keeping up with the technology, coordinating interdependent systems, and thus we talk about programs and portfolios. Lots of challenges to look at, but I think as we study project management, we keep all of this in mind. You'll see how the right people in the right place with the right tools, the right skills, the right background, and the right perspective will enhance the opportunity for an organization to have successful projects. So that's it. It was a lot to cover in a very short period of time. It is just laying the context around which we're going to be studying projects and project management. We're going to be looking at each aspect of the project in largely a linear or chronological flow as we grow our understanding of project management. And we're going to start that off with looking at that pre-project phase, looking at the business documents, the business case, the benefits analysis, all of those things that go into the selection of the project as a desirable business endeavor. So with that, we're going to close this one off. We'll see you in the next phase, and I promise you no more videos this long. See you there.